and like learning for just growing your knowledge, and just I think learning for the sake of just education, just like learning and developing yourself. I think that gets lost out in VCE. How do I make myself more efficient? If you're doing 50 practice exams and you're not really learning from them, then you're just gonna have the same score at the end of the 50 exam. Like, yes, I think they're more a reflection of the work you put in and the discipline and the effort, but they're not a reflection of like who you are. When there is progression, it helps to have already stood on the next step, because then you're confident enough if you can get to the 95th floor that you won't be scared of heights at the 90th floor because you've been to the 95th floor.
Today on episode 3 of Amongst the Uncommon, I have one of the highest achieving yet one of the most humble people with me, Amitav Madan. Just for some context, since Amitav himself is way too modest to mention these, he graduated from John Monash Science School with an ATAR of 99.80, is a VCE baccalaureate, achieved a raw 50 study scores in both methods and Hindi with Premier's Awards. He also got high distinctions in Australian physics and chemistry Olympiads, having also won nationals in International Young Physicist Tournament and represented Australia on an international level. Furthermore, he is a KLD scholar and Monash scholar. So having done all this man shows no sign of stopping and is now a founder of the tutoring company Contour Education. I think these achievements speak for themselves, so without further ado, let's get into the episode. Super excited today. We got Amitav on. Amitav, let me just paint a picture for everyone listening. So this is my impression. You probably laugh at this, but at every goddamn assembly, every freaking assembly, we have that, like our entire school just knows. Even if you're not in our year level, like you just know. When we go through the awards, HD, Amitav is always there. Any achievement, whatever it is, like competition, Amitav. So it was at a meme. It was just a meme at that point. So just to paint a little picture for those listening. But no, like, yeah, so my impression of Amitav, we didn't really, I didn't really first talk to him when I first joined our school in year 11, but as I got to know him, like I thought he was just this like genius kid, but then like he never brags about it. That's what's so interesting. Like this guy's so humble. I just never hear you brag about it, man. Like,
I mean, yeah, it just feels weird to talk about yourself in that way, like trying to, I don't know, it just feels weird to
no, that's totally it just speaks well of you, like because most kids at our age, like, you know, it's hard to kind of keep the ego down when you're like a dumb teenager. Like you got a little bit of achievement, like you want to like tell everyone about it, which is totally normal.
That's true.
And man, I feel like you've achieved enough to definitely be proud of yourself. So anyways, that's enough. That's enough speaking well of you. Gonna roast you for the rest of the podcast. Nah.
Wow, I see how it is.
Man. So what are you up to now, man? I haven't seen you since year 12. What are you studying?
So I'm studying a Bachelor of Science at the University of Melbourne, and I was just really at the end of last year I was a bit like just overall very confused about what I wanted to, in terms of like academics. I was very unsure of like
because
what I wanted to go into.
Yeah, because you definitely had the capability to do whatever you wanted, right? So was science your plan to start with?
It ended up, because I one thing I knew was I didn't want to do kind of med and like that side of things,
right?
Just like bio or med. So then after that, ATAR I guess wasn't a big like hurdle necessarily, and so at that point I was just like deciding between Monash and Melbourne, between like science, computer science, something like that, like in that sort of field, and that definitely in the STEM field, but I was never really certain, and so that's why I chose like the broadest possible in general, I guess. I've been working on Contour Education, which is a business we set up with me, Angad, and Sai from John Monash as well.
Yes, so we've all heard. So tell us about that.
So it was basically, it started off as like an idea sometime last year of doing Mathematica tutoring. And then that kind of evolved slowly into like now we tutor like about 100 plus kids in various different VC subjects of physics, maths, chemistry, enviro and stuff. So just like lots of tutoring. So basically just
that's
tutoring,
awesome, man.
And just that's what I've kind of I guess been busy with and kept myself occupied with.
I can imagine. So you guys I guess are on. So I'm guessing like since you got so much such a wide base now, do you kind of pull away from like the front lines of like tutoring and more on the managing side?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. So it's like, more of the business, kind of growing the business and thinking about that aspect of things, but also kind of keeping in touch at the same time with
of course,
with the students. And for sure.
Yeah. So how did you, first of all, like who came up with that idea? Because it's super, not only ambitious, but at the same time, it just takes, because a lot of people, they say everyone wants to do something, right? They're like, oh, I want to start a podcast. I want to do a YouTube channel or Instagram, whatever. But then few people actually have the execution to follow through. So was that like a quality that you've always had, or where did that come from?
Well, I think at some level I always knew I wanted to do something other than just like school or uni and so on. And I think that's kind of what I tried to do all the time at school as well, is like focus on what's outside of class, just like doing something else. Just to keep myself not just busy, but also kind of keeping myself stimulated by doing something different. And I think that's in terms of like how I ended up kind of, I guess, executing, was just like that's what I've been doing so far as well. And so it kind of just felt natural. I don't know if there's, I guess, like a hurdle that I had to necessarily pass. It was just like natural progression. It just made sense to do something.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what was like your biggest fear when you first started Contour? Because I'm imagining like starting anything, there's got to be like some kind of mental barrier, like, you know, what if I fail? What if this? What if that? Did you have those questions in your head? And like, if so, like, how did you kind of deal with them?
Yeah, I think the biggest advantage that we had with something like Contour was just like, because like at the age we're at and like at the level we're at right now, which is like just out of high school, we basically had like nothing to lose type thing. Like there's no downside, and there's like lots of upside potential, but there's not necessarily a downside. Like what's the worst that can happen? Like we just like end up spending 6 months or 1 year or 2 years on something that doesn't work out in long term. But that's not really, like, if you think about it in the big picture, I guess it's never really, that's not a big loss at all. Like you end up learning so much about just everything from doing something like this. And I think that was the motivation of that. That's what it just made sense to like go ahead with something like this without thinking too much of like what could happen.
Yeah, I think that's a super positive perspective as well, because yeah, it's pretty obvious. Like when you just come out of high school, like you really haven't built enough to lose. Does that make sense? And
exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So would you reckon there was also not social aspect, but rather because you partner up with Sai and Angad and maybe some other friends, like, would you think you would have had as easy of a time in terms of ambition and planning if you had to do it alone? Or did you think like having your friends there with you and kind of feeding that energy off of each other made the whole journey easier, and also like being able to overcome these resistance? Because it's always easier when you get to do it with someone, right? Because any obstacle you face, you can like handle it together. You have someone who's got your back.
Oh yeah, no, 100% agree. Like it's definitely so much easier when you're working with someone who's also a friend, and like it's like it just makes more sense to kind of, everything just kind of links together, and you just build off of each other, like throwing ideas around, and just because you know the other person, it's not just like a very formal or business relationship or anything like that. And I think that helps a huge lot with how much you can achieve together. Like it's no longer a linear addition of just like two people adding up to like twice. You're adding up to much more than that, because you're able to, you know, the other person's strengths and weaknesses. And I'm sure you've like probably experienced it with just anything in general. Like even if you're studying with friends, you know, like kind of what they're thinking and how they're thinking, and that kind of helps you even kind of understand like where the other person's coming from and kind of build ideas together off each other.
But having said that though, not to go on too much of a tangent, because I do want to get to a lot of the VC side, but this is super interesting to me and I want to learn a lot from you. So would you say there's any downside though to working with people who are already in your friendship group? Because I know they can be, because at least for me on a micro scale, so let's just say a study group, right? Sometimes it depends on what we work on obviously, but sometimes having those friendship qualities there can sometimes lead to inefficiencies. Have you seen that anywhere? Was there a lot of, because I'm only just guessing, so was that even a challenge for you guys, or you guys were able to all stay on track and just make all of your time as productive as possible?
I think it's definitely, I mean, yeah, it's of course it's easier to get distracted when you're like with friends when you're working on something compared to if you were like in a kind of a business meeting or something like that. It's, yeah, no, 100% it becomes way easier to get distracted. But I think at the same time, those distractions in kind of a more zoomed out and like bigger picture perspective, it's those distractions still, they end up being a positive experience. And so when you think about it as a whole experience, then you're connecting that positive experience, like if you're laughing at a joke and like just spending time with friends while working on your business or like whatever you're working on, that kind of helps the overall, like it just makes you want to do it more, just because part of it is just like pure enjoyment as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, that's definitely something to be, I guess, enviable about, especially if you have that like great team. Because I know about Sai and Anga, they're just great, like super competent people to work with. So yeah, man, that's super exciting. And hope, do you have any visions or goals for it, or did you just start off as like, we just wanna run this tutoring company and we'll just see where it goes, or did you have any other motivations for it or expectations?
Oh no, yeah, for sure. We want to. So now we see kind of the potential of growing it into a more of an education company. So not just like your average tutoring, I guess, like just any other what other tutors would be doing in the state, but we want to build something more out of it. Kind of really change how students and how people are thinking about. They think about just tutoring and like education in general. Like learning doesn't have to be you're in the classroom doing like 50 tests, 50 exams, and then you're kind of like, we want to kind of change that and bring a more positive perspective on not just VC, but just kind of learning at school in general, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's talk about that. So what exactly do you mean when you say like you want to bring something extra? Do you mean like tap more into the curiosity side for like the more pure kind of essence of learning itself? Because I know, and a lot of people's experiences that VC can be sort of treated as a game where, because you have a certain end goal, right? Your end goal, I guess it's a flaw of the system, or maybe that's by design, or, you know, it might just be an unfortunate outcome. But for me, I always looked at it as, okay, my goal isn't primarily to learn, because, and as I've mentioned before, like what I got out of VC wasn't exactly the content and the knowledge, but rather, I guess the knowledge, but rather like the skills and character I've built throughout this journey, as well as the relationships. So how would you kind of, I guess, overcome that kind of perspective and try not to get stuck in that, not necessarily cynical, but I guess more of a just overly pragmatic outlook, I guess?
I think one, like as you said, it is really about like VC just by itself as a separate entity. It is very much a game of like knowing exactly what, for example, like your assessor is looking for, and like figuring out exactly what I need to write on an exam to get that mark and that kind of thing. But I think where you lose out in that whole, in the setting of school due to that, is learning just for the sake of learning, and like learning for just growing your knowledge, and just, I think learning for the sake of just education, just like learning and developing yourself. I think that gets lost out in VC, like not having learning detached from exam taking and like how you're getting assessed and the ATAR that's coming out of it, kind of connecting that together by things like increasing collaboration in like classrooms, even in tutoring, and things like increasing interaction as well. So interaction with the tutor, and like as treating the tutor not necessarily as just like this output of just formulas, but more like a friend and a mentor that can really give you that perspective of like how they've experienced learning and how they actually learned, which might like ultimately teach you how, or like help students kind of develop their their experience of learning, like make it better, make it a more positive experience rather than a very mechanical like exam taking and like that sort of. Yeah,
no, because one thing I guess just my impression of you during year 12 was definitely, I think you embodied more of that. I don't know if it's just your personality or like the way you approach studying, but I've always been more goal oriented and definitely missed out on a lot of like the learning for the sake of learning, the enjoyment, and definitely that in an ideal world, that should be what high school is about. But let's set that aside. But yeah, I just found it interesting that you kind of embodied that. Would that be accurate to say? Because I always found that you were always going beyond the content and sort of, because you were joining all these competitions and seemingly like you didn't focus on the game as much, or maybe that you just didn't have to, or what was that like for you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think so. What happened with me, I think personally, was so I think it's probably like important that I bring up kind of what I did before kind of John Monash. So I was in India before, which was that kind of schooling system there was very exam oriented and very like very into that game. Like that's what they taught you, is how to be excellent at that game. And then
right, so it's the bad side of VCE times 10.
Exactly, like times 100, and then zero of anything else, like just nothing else. That's all you do. So then you it's inevitable that you're gonna get good at that because there's no other option. And like I'm exaggerating a bit here, but it's like that was the main focus of just school over there. And I think how that helped me, like specifically, was it set me ahead in terms of just the VCE game, because I was just like, I just knew more intuitively by the time year 12 or year 11 came. I just knew more intuitively and more just with more experience, I guess, with just kind of what examiners are looking for and how to game the exam and how to game assessments, which then meant I didn't have to spend as much time, I guess, to like perfect or increase my like marks basically, or like increase my performance at the game of VCE. And what that meant was then I could focus on the more learning aspect of things, so then that's why I was able to, I guess, have the time for like going for competition. And then that was my focus during school as well, was like, what can I do outside of school? Like, not, of course I'm doing class, because like everyone's doing class, you have to do class, but what can I do outside of that, which will help? Either I'll learn something new, which is then I'm happy with that, because that's just, I've learned something new and I'm happy just learning. Like I enjoy learning about anything new. Or if I can like develop some skill or work with other people, like build better relationships with people, or like just anything that helps me grow as a person, I guess, was then became the aim. Like, and I was able to build time for that during school, and like I was able to actively look for that as well. I guess that's the other thing is when, like, I guess a lot of your time, if it gets taken up with just exams and I think that's what ends up happening with a lot of people doing VCE, is just getting shrouded with like exams, assessments, there's a SAT coming up, there's this coming up, and so on. And so then you're not left with much time to think about all the other things, which then like that's where I guess I had an advantage for sure, with just the fact that I took less time doing that.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful perspective, because I guess a lot of people, when they look at especially high achievers, and for people like you who didn't even seemingly focus on the game itself, a lot of people tend to fall in this trap of thinking, okay, that is just pure talent. But I think from your story, what I found inspiring was that it's because you took the discipline, you took the harsh environment of that, like the bad side of it, VCE multiplied by 100 in India, which throughout what age did you go through that?
So, so exams start it depends on like the type of school you go to, but if you're an average student in India, you start exams when you're 5-6 years old. But I was lucky, so my parents, like, I went to a private school there, which meant exams started in, I think it was year 4 or 5, between year 4 and 5. So when I was like 10, 11, something like that.
Yep. So that kind of just test taking ability, which in itself is super valuable, was already ingrained in you from a young age.
Yeah. Well, there was like no other option, kind of, I guess.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that sort of, because have you heard of the Jocko Willink and his concept of discipline equals freedom, which I rave about a lot. But essentially I think I see that in action again, whereas like kind of, I guess it wasn't fun, right? Like we can only imagine, like when you're 8 years old or 10 years old, the last thing you want to do is to do that kind of crap in school, especially like even for like 17, 18-year-olds who are in VC now, we hate that aspect. But for a young child to go through that, and so definitely I think you definitely earned your freedom in year 12 with that kind of discipline, even though it was imposed on you. It wasn't by choice, but nevertheless. So yeah, would you then kind of advise people who kind of, I guess, even feel a sense of hopelessness in that they look at people like you where they only see the appearance and they think, damn, like, this guy's just born lucky, he's just talented, instead of saying, oh, okay, let's look at his background, let's look at what he's been through? Because to be honest, I don't believe in the fact that, even though we clown you a lot for like, whatever, being a genius, but no, truly, I believe that talent itself isn't enough. And I have no doubt in my mind, you definitely went through something that was exceptional, meaning that a lot of people didn't do. So a lot of people might look at those who are quote unquote naturally good at math or good at English, but they don't see the side where they put in the effort or whether it be like reading from a young age or whether it be born into an environment like India where it was 10 times more competitive. I kind of resonate with that because I was born in China and the environment, I got a taste of that, but luckily I left after grade 2. So yeah, definitely. So what would be your advice for people when they just see that exterior, and instead of making excuses, how would you advise them to move forward to achieve their best?
I think that's a really interesting question. I agree with your what you said about kind of talent and hard work, or like just discipline, having that discipline of working through the things and experiencing those hardships and those like tough time, like challenging yourself, kind of aside from just pure talent. Because I think when you say talent, it's also a bit of like, how would you define talent, I guess?
So for me, So for me, talent purely is just given the same information and effort input, you get a more efficient output of knowledge and utility. So that's my definition. But I know a lot of people can think talent is just like all different sorts of factors. Like they don't like take into account work or whatever. So some people will say you're just smart, or like like stuff like that. So I guess my definition would just be purely that for the same effort you get more out of it.
Yep. Okay, so I think with kind of, I guess with that, again, it's like at some level the India thing comes in again, where it's like I would, in general, just because I've lived that, I have to like digest lots of information and spit it out in an exam. That's kind of that's become sort of more intuitive, just to process and like spit out at the end type thing. But no, in general, I think in terms of kind of giving advice or kind of, I guess, a different perspective on learning, is a lot of it really comes down to working. This is what I believe, is working kind of smarter instead of harder. Like it's not necessarily, because I feel like what a lot of people end up doing is this happens. Like if you ask some year 12 right now about, like if you're talking to them about studying, the first question they'll ask is, how many practice exams did you do to get this score? And it's like, that's it. It's not really about like the number of hours you put in. It's much more about the quality of that time and that effort. And I think that's where it's a bit of both in terms of talent and hard work, because at some level, yes, you might be better at, like, you might just be intrinsically better at being more efficient with your time. But I think that at the same time, that can be trained very well, like that can be trained a lot with just putting more effort into how do I make myself more efficient. Yes. Because if you're just doing like it just comes down to, if you're doing 50 practice exams and you're not really learning from them, then you're just going to have the same score at the end of the 50 exams.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. So I guess the confusion there is that working smart in itself, that's not a talent. That's just in a sense a choice. And whether or not you have that kind of realization, that comes down to your environment. So what I kind of talk about is, given the same methodology and given everything else equal, you just simply read faster. You just simply learn faster and retain information faster. Because what you said about, that was a really good point, by the way. And I've talked about this before as well. So for me, because I like to think about it as working smarter and working harder is not actually two completely separate things. Because if you're truly putting effort, which is how I define as working hard, if you want to really put in the mental effort, it takes more mental effort to go through that process of self-reflection and finding those methods to work harder, instead of just work smarter, sorry. So instead of just grinding through practice exams mindlessly, because in that sense, you're still taking the path of least resistance comparatively, if that makes sense. Because the harder thing is not doing the practice exams, but it's rather correcting it and reflecting it in a way that is effective. And as you said, and that's working smarter. So yeah, you're 100% right. So when people ask, how many exams did you do? It doesn't matter. It's not about that. But at the same time, if they took the same methodology and the same level of self-reflection and the same amount of like conscientiousness into their reflection, and they can still do more practice exams than someone who is just naturally, I don't want to say naturally because there are so many different factors that go into it, but let's say this is in a perfect world, there's twins, identical genes, or rather identical environment, sorry, and then you just have a different set of genes that allows you to be somewhat more competent at a certain task. So that's how I purely define talent. But yeah, that's a super interesting discussion. And I think people, I think you're right. So in that aspect, working smart is more important.
Yeah.
But
and it's like working smart is the harder path.
Right, exactly.
Like, so then,
Yeah, so I don't think there's too much debate between us there. I think we're all in the same kind of agreement. So did you ever feel like in a time in Australia, what was like your lowest moment? Or did you ever feel like, damn, am I just not good enough? Or damn, like this is just too hard? Have you ever had those moments?
At school, I wouldn't, like, to be completely honest, I wouldn't say so. So I've never kind of felt low about academics at school at all. Like I've just never had, I guess I just haven't experienced like complete, like just I've like failed something and then I just completely down and I don't know what to do anymore type thing.
Right.
I don't think I've had that with school. And at some level, I feel like I should have. Like that's not a good thing that I haven't experienced that, which means I don't even know if I could deal with it. If I did, when I do experience that, inevitably at some point I will. And so it's like, I think at some level, I personally think I would have benefited more than like rode along comfortably. I would have benefited if I did experience that, but I don't think looking back, I don't think so. I ever felt helpless.
So at what point during your life did you think you went through the hardest kind of challenge, whether it be academically or just you found the environment to be tough in India, anything like that?
I think the hardest part for me, like so far, kind of the hardest phase in my life has been moving. So when we moved from like India to here, because it was a huge, not just like a culture difference, but also like a lot of the little things that you're used to over there, including stuff like even language, like language itself was a big thing because like we didn't speak in English over there. And like, even though we went to an international school, whatever, like no one actually spoke in English, for example, at school. And so I think that sort of settling into the new culture very suddenly at an age, like I was in year 9 when I came. And so I think that was a big kind of, it was a shock to me initially. Like, even though I like my parents had prepared us, like me and my sister, for that, and we kind of knew what was coming, but it was like, obviously at that age, it was just a huge kind of shock at that time. And that was probably the biggest challenge, I would say, like 100% so far.
So would it be fair to say like you never really, after experiencing kind of the intensity in India, like after you came to Australia, it was just kind of like cruising along? Like the system here and the competition just wasn't that strong?
At school, and like in terms of academics, yes, I would say so.
But that's totally fine to say.
At the same time, I guess I don't want to say that's because just because I was in India, that's why I got whatever ATAR I got and so on. Like, I don't want to say it was the reason for it, but I think it did give me an advantage. Like, I don't want to kind of discount the advantage that I had, but at the same time, I also don't want to say that's the only way I could have as well. Like, if I was here, it might have been a different pathway, but there was still a way for me to get there type thing.
Right, 100%.
But yeah.
Yeah, no. Obviously, like, we're not trying to discredit like the amount of work you put in afterwards, but I understand what you said about like it being an advantage. I felt a similar way in China because like I came here after grade 2, and then like primary school, I just cruised through math classes. Like it's just the fact. Like they just put kids through, I guess, more densely packed curriculum in like more Asian countries, and it's just the fact that like it's a better environment. It's more fun here in Australia, and everyone especially the culture, I think, as well, because in China, like, and you can speak about India, but so it's essentially like studying is placed as such a high importance. Whereas in Australia, like maybe they're a bit more lenient, like, you can just be whatever you want. You can just be happy. Or whereas in China, like the entire culture is like, essentially the exam to uni is everything. That's how they like to think about it. Even though, I don't know, maybe it's my perspective having lived here. It doesn't feel so true, but maybe in China, that's how they think about it. Was that similar? Was that a similar situation for you?
Yeah, very similar. The focus and the societal importance that's placed on getting A+ and like getting into the best university you can, the best course you can, it's I think it's way too high, and it doesn't have to be that high to achieve just like something in life, something good in life. You don't like, that's not what's making people happy, is if you get into that course. It's like that's not, it doesn't have to be kind of the aim of life.
Yeah, even let's bring that perspective back to VC. So even a lot of people, including me, at some stage, I was like, okay, if I just get this really high ATAR, my life will be set. Like that's an easy mindset to fall into. But having completed VC and achieved what you have achieved, now how much can you rest, quote unquote, rest on your laurels? And like, do you think it like matters as people think it does? Matters as much as people used to think it does?
I don't think so. Like, just from a very kind of, I guess, objective view on it, is like, if you just think about kind of where the ATAR comes into play, for example, it's just once you get into your course, after that, no one's really going to ask you ATAR. Maybe if you're getting an internship, then maybe they'll look at like 2 years of academics. But really, it's more just about like, after that, the ATAR itself doesn't matter. And I think even in terms of like marks or just kind of academic achievements, they're not gonna, like, yes, I think they're more a reflection of the work you put in and the discipline and the effort, but they're not a reflection of like who you are. And like, that's not really, I wouldn't define myself with the 99 point whatever. And like, I wouldn't define myself with my ATAR. I did achieve that, like, without discounting it as well. There's like I guess a fine balance to strike there. It's without discounting the effort that's gone into it, it's not something that is really gonna, like, I recognize that it's not something that's gonna give me a huge, like, because what it might look like for a year 9 or a year 12 student, just because VCE makes the ATAR this big, like, achievement, this big hurdle you have to get to, I think from that side it does look like it is the be all and end all. But I think once you do it, like, I'm sure like you might feel something similar with, like, in terms of just thinking about the ATAR, is it's very like, after you get it, it's like, now what? Like, you move on to the next thing. You don't necessarily look back and
Exactly. So I think it really helps to have that perspective. So I wish I had that back in year 12, like maybe it wouldn't have pushed me to work as hard as I did, but regardless, that's the truth, so yeah, exactly. Like Amitav said, like, after uni, it's the stepping stone to get into uni, and afterwards it really doesn't come into play that much. Right. And for me, it just goes into the back of my mind, and then just becomes another piece of achievement that I can like look back on and think it just kind of like use it as evidence for confidence. So so that's essentially its value. And obviously, do you think so? You said you wouldn't attribute your achievement entirely to your experience in India, which is 100% fair to say. There's no like a single aspect, obviously. So what would you say was the biggest factor that contributed to that?
So when you say achievement, like, it basically VCE, like, results?
Yes, VCE.
Like, okay, yeah. I think the biggest thing I would attribute that to is the fact that I looked at everything other. I tried to look as far away from that as possible. And then I treated it as an inevitability more than a main focus. So it was always like, how can I learn about, for example, how can I learn about physics in like 5 other ways, which will automatically like help me do well in VCE physics? How can I learn about maths by doing like an Olympiad and like maybe a competition, a team competition, making a video about maths? How can I do those 3 or 4 things about maths, which will give me a much more open mind about just maths concepts in general? And that will help me then when I'm sitting an exam, or like when I'm practicing for an exam, I'll just have more connections between concepts and just have like a more intuitive understanding of things, like concepts and just and the reason I say concepts is because mostly like all the STEM subjects were about kind of just linking together concepts and like being able to recall, when do I need to use like X and Y, and when do I need to use this to solve this question, because it's a lot of problem solving in that sense. And I think that's where that helped me a lot, is just because I got a lot of like exposure to problem solving from like 5 other places that inevitably helped me at school. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say.
Right, that's super fascinating, but it's also curious because you said that you achieved because you looked away from that rather than focusing in on the game itself, because as we've talked about before, you already know the game so well, so you don't need to focus on that aspect. And rather, so for you, it can just be about finding those underlying concepts and techniques that you can apply to solve. Because when we do questions, like I've had kind of like this realization as well later as I got through more practice exams, because the same question is never going to come up again, but it's the techniques and the skill itself, or rather like you just get more perspective on how to solve a certain problem by doing other problems, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a important truth, but at the same time, I think that might be a bit unique to your certain situation. Would that be fair to say?
Oh yeah, 100%. I was gonna say I realize it's easy for me to say that I did all these things because I had the time to do them, because I obviously didn't have to spend as much time on the game, on the VC, on the how to get like marks in exam. But at the same time, I think that, like, yeah, of course, if doing just those extra things and not really knowing or focusing or putting time into understanding how do assessments work and what are assessors looking for, like not even putting any time into that and just doing extra stuff, that extra stuff isn't like check mark. If I do 3 Olympiads, I'll get a 45 in methods. Like that's not right. Obviously it's not as simple as that, but like I think obviously the focus should be first, I would say, to understand, at least get yourself to at least a certain level of understanding the game, understanding how do exams work and like exactly what assessors are looking for. Because I think what you said just then about the questions, like when you're doing practice questions, even though questions aren't the same, the thing that is the same is the accessibility, as in what's the exam writer, why did they write that question? Like what that part usually stays the same. Like that's what's repeatable, is because it's a physics it's a year 12 physics course. So like 40 years ago, what people learned in physics, it's the same. It's pretty much the same as what we're learning today. And so that accessibility, that concept ticking off, like the physics exam wants to test that you understand how A and B interact with each other. That part doesn't change. The way it's communicated, obviously it's going to change. Like maybe today the question will be relevant to something that only happened in the last 40 years. But it's like the concepts that are clicking inside your brain, those are very similar. Like those are the constants that stay through. And this is specifically about exams mostly. It's like those are similar. And so that's if you teach yourself to recognize those patterns. So not patterns in the questions, but patterns in like why the kind of like thinking from the assessor's point of view and asking yourself, why am I being asked this question? Like why am I being asked this question? And it's 3 marks. What's 3 marks worth of concepts that I need to communicate to the assessor that will tell them that I know the concept? Like you might know the concept, but if you can't communicate it in those 3 marks, that's also like, then that's not useful, kind of for the exam at least.
Right. So yeah, I'm painting a picture where, so on one aspect, you have like the true kind of the underlying message and the whole point of the course that you're trying to teach. So that's your underlying concepts right there. And then the questions is just like a vehicle for that. It's just different modes of delivery of the same concept, but rather wrapped in a way such that you have to apply some type of creativity, especially for the last few questions on an exam, to kind of unlock that. So would you say that by doing the competition and stuff outside of school, are you grasping the core concepts more clearly? Or would you say you're gaining more tools to break down the lock, which is the question that is holding the concept itself? Because there is only so much to know about the concept, but at the same time, the more you understand it, the more naturally you'll be able to apply it to different scenarios, right? So, so did your experience outside of that give you kind of a advantage or experience in one of them, or both? Or would you say like either or?
I think for sure both. Like that's a really nice way you put it, kind of put it all together into one image. Like it all kind of, just makes sense how on the one side you have the actual concept and then the vehicle, which is like you've got to unpack the question to understand which part of the concept it was linking to. But I think it gives both. Like you're right, with STEM, a lot of it. So like when I did Olympiads, for example, I didn't learn year 12 physics, but what I did learn was like a year ahead of physics, which means it's like if you think about now, if you have to do 2-digit addition, that'll feel obviously easy to do compared to what it did when you were 5 years old learning that at school for the first time. Do you know what I mean? So it's like if you've done the next step, it becomes, because you've done a harder thing, it's now easier. This is in terms of the concept itself. The core concept feels easier just because you've seen how much more complex it gets. And even though you don't understand that complex part completely, this part feels simple now. The actual what's being tested at school feels a lot simpler because you've exposed yourself to like a harder thing. So that's in terms of the concept. So even though you've learned everything about the concept here, you've also done that extra, like the next year level or the next, just like 3 years level.
So would you say like the next level involves a more nuanced understanding of the concept itself, or rather because that you're dealing with the next level, it simply just introduces more tools and perspectives through which you can actually apply to a simpler scenario? Because I'm not sure if this sounds really confusing, but essentially what I'm trying to get at is like, by those experiences, because let's say on the final, what makes the question hard, right? Because once you see the solution, everyone thinks, oh, I could have gotten that because I had the core skills. So therefore, wouldn't it make sense to say, okay, the core concepts themselves aren't what is hard? Because so let's say for like a really tricky methods question, you have to do some like convoluted graphing and then find the intercept, whatever. But in each of the individual steps, everyone would be able to do, even a student who like barely listens in class. But the hard part about the question is actually the way it is packaged, right? Because it kind of conceals the steps you need to do in a really convoluted way. So because then my mind is thinking, okay, so by doing those extra harder concepts, the concept is harder, but then wouldn't that automatically mean your tools for unlocking that is also harder? And by getting that tool set, you're able to apply it to the easier concept. So I don't know, it sounds a bit confusing, and I'm trying to figure this out because what you said before really inspired this concept to me. So so what are your thoughts on that?
I think definitely. So that the building a better tool set just because you've been exposed, that's definitely like one of the advantages. But I think at some level, a lot of concepts tend to build off of previous year's concepts. So if you've learned, and this probably applies, I feel like this applies more to STEM, but it should, I think, apply to everything, but I'm not sure. But in general. So because like concepts in general, like learning at school and at university, at any sort of institution, it's always going to be, there is some element of a linear progression to it. Like there is some element of you're building off of something you learned last year or 3 years ago or last week, but you're like gradually developing knowledge. It's not just like random tidbits of information from everywhere. It does have progression to it. And I think that when there is progression, it helps to have already stood on the next step, because then you're confident enough if you can get to the 95th floor that you won't be scared of heights at the 90th floor because you've been to the 95th floor. So it's like but then it's not just about the tool set. I think it's also at least a little bit about also the actual concept, so the concept itself. Because if you applied, I'm trying to like relate it to an example. So if you applied, for example, if you've learned calculus and applied it to trig graphs, just the trig graph by itself is going to now feel easier because you just understand more about it because you've now done the calculus part of the trig graph. So it's like just a sine graph now by itself makes more sense. Like some parts of it just make more sense because you've learned a deeper level about them. So it's like, yeah, I feel like there's an element of both probably, but the tool set definitely. So you like being exposed to that calculus bit now has taught you that you can use XYZ from that and apply it to the trig graph.
Yeah.
And so then you use like,
Yeah, so the way I'm picturing it right now is you have the essence of what you're being taught, the concept itself in VCE, which let's just say is like the inner part of an onion. For some reason, that's my analogy coming up now. And the way that they try to package it is by adding skin onto it, right? So let's say in that sense, you get a certain level of thickness that corresponds with the difficulty. But by going beyond, even though you're adding to the core of the onion itself, but by doing that, you kind of already have to contend with the smaller core, which is what VCE only demands. But for you, if you've already seen that extra layer of difficulty, then it's kind of like already resistance training, right? It doesn't matter like what form of complexity you add onto it. It can be packaging in a different question, like a really weird question as they do in VCE, or it can be just simply adding the next level of concept onto it. So that way you're still, to use like a training analogy, like progressively overloading your brain in that sense. So therefore, every time you do a question that involves the next level concept, you have to already have mastered what's inside.
Yeah,
so
it's like the new normal that you that's your standard now, and you're just moving it up. You're just bumping it up.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I wish I had this perspective in VC because it feels so true to me now. But I think I might have glimpsed a little bit of what we just talked about when I spoke to you in year 12. But so I always thought that, okay, if I'm just trying to accomplish this goal, why? It's like if I'm just learning to like do a doggy paddle or something, right, in a pool, then if you're telling me to go learn freestyle or butterfly just so I can be better at the doggy style, then it's like, why do that extra step? So that didn't make sense in my brain.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put it in a training analogy, it's like, okay, if you can't do normal push-ups, then if you go, say, bench some weights, or if you put a resistance on your back and you start training push-ups that way, in the end, you might be still working the same kind of muscles and you're still reinforcing the same concepts. But would you say there would be a trap inherent in that, where because most people don't necessarily have the foundation of like knowing how to, again, like work with the system and break down what the assessor is actually looking for? Do you think if they took that approach of going beyond the current level, even though you might have a really solid grasp on the concept, do you think they would be actually missing some really key, just some really pragmatic parts to doing well in VCE? I'm not sure if I'm making that clear.
No, I think I know what you mean. So it's like if you jump kind of too far ahead, you might have missed some really important things, which would help you with VC. And I think perhaps there is, like, perhaps it is possible to distract yourself almost with extending yourself. It might be you might end up veering too far off VC, but. So there's two perspectives I have on this probably. Is one is like a more optimistic, big picture point of view. If you zoom out, you've still learned way more than you would have doing the VC subject. So like in a big picture life perspective, you've still learned a lot. So even if your ATAR was like 10 points lower, zooming out, you've learned more and you've exposed yourself to more and you've grown more during that time. That's like one perspective on it. And I think, but the other thing is, I forgot what I was going to say. The other...
I'll come back to you. So, actually I had something in my mind as well. So good. But Yeah. So I had a specific example in mind for the problem that I was trying to illustrate. So for example, the concept of just like dealing with power in physics, right? So something simple as that. So you can have the concept 100% down, but a 3-mark explanation question, for example, number one, it can like require you simply just write the formula or write the formula in a certain way or state a certain statement that might feel obvious otherwise, right? So that's kind of like the game aspect I was talking about, because even though you might have had that exposure in India, but I'd imagine the system is still nuanced. Like you might be aware of the presence of like, okay, they're going to throw some shady bullshit in this question that you have to do. That's not necessarily true to the concept, but you just have to do because they fucking said so. So that's the aspect I'm kind of talking about. So if you're focused on just getting, because like the sad truth is the highest achievers aren't always the most like candid learners such as yourself. And what you said about the long term, exactly, because the long term strategy, as you said, which is I believe like in an ideal world that's what you should be aiming for, right? But in a short term VC, if we just want the highest ATAR maximization, that might hurt you to a certain degree, because let's take an example of like, actually I don't want to name any names, but so people who are super talented in math and they go further beyond the VC, but in the end, they're not necessarily the ones who are getting the raw 50s, if that makes sense.
Yep.
So what will be your perspective on that? Is it just, look, VC is not just that, it's not worth it, you should just focus on your life development, or rather, okay, if your goal is to simply maximize your VC score, then the pragmatic approach would be learn the concepts, dabble in some harder problem solving, but also make sure you master those little game aspects of VC before you go do that.
Yep. I think, it kind of comes down to what is your aim with it. Like if you want to achieve the highest ATAR you can, like if that is the aim you have for your VC kind of year 11, 12, 10, 11, 12, then I do think extending with other out of class things isn't as useful as it is like just in a life perspective. But yeah, so if your aim is to kind of achieve the best you can for VCE, then I believe, yes, you've got to first, like the main priority then is obviously to master the game, to understand the intricacies of the game. And I think that's at some level, when I like compared to India as well, it's not necessarily like that, just the fact that I've been exposed to it, I don't need to, it's not the same things they're looking for example, in exams in India to exams here, but it's more just like knowing that they're looking for something. I think there's a level where you're just doing an exam from a student perspective and you're never thinking about this is an exam and there's a reason a question is 3 marks and there's a reason the assessor is asking this question in this order, and like that sort of thing. I think that's probably what it taught me more than exactly like in physics you're supposed to write formulas, and like in maths you're supposed to do graphs.
Okay.
But I think that's what I mean, just like more like awareness, more on a not a specific level of like this is how to do physics exams. I didn't learn that from India and apply it directly here. It was more like being aware of just the nature of exams in general, if that makes sense. So
that makes sense.
Why are exams a thing type thing? Like why are exams the way they are? Why is there marks on an exam? And how, and then going into like, okay, how can I for this specific subject do this to get the marks for this specific subject? And that, I guess, yeah.
Yep. And I'd imagine having that perspective of like, okay, standing from the assessor's point of view, I'd imagine that would actually help with the problem-solving process itself. So could you maybe take us through that? So let's say you're just faced with a question, like seemingly you don't know what to do, but do you like identify what are the key concepts being assessed here? Or what's that process like? So last question on exam, like, I don't know, methods exam. So like, how would you approach that?
Yeah. So there's probably 2 or 3 things that I would do here. Is one would be like looking at, so this is when I'm completely like stumped by a question, for example, and like I don't know what to do. So the couple of things I would look at is try to extract as many hints as I can from the question itself. And what I mean by that is looking at the marking scheme, which seems like an obvious thing to do, but I feel like connecting that to concept. So if a question is 2 marks, there's only a certain amount of thinking you'll have to do, compared to if the question's 4 marks. You'll be expected to either do lots of arithmetic, but also maybe you're expected to delve like a layer deeper into the concepts. And so like priming your brain to recall the concepts that required around 2 marks of thinking, around 2 marks of complex thinking, obviously that part comes from practicing exams and knowing what to expect. So if you've done like 5 practice exams, then you know what a 2-mark question looks like, and then you can, when you then see it, another 2-mark question, and you don't know what to do, you can think of what are the kinds of concepts that came into play when a 2-mark question was being asked. And the other thing is like looking at the question stem, like keywords and like what exactly it's asking you. On like lots of times that helps. And I feel like with STEM, like specifically physics, maths, chemistry, those sort of subjects, any numbers in the question, any variables, like of course that's what the actual meat of the question is. That's where the formula, you might be able to use a formula and so on. But yeah, I think basically really breaking apart individual parts of a question to think about what concepts can I link here that will probably be what the marking scheme was. So it's like almost guessing the marking scheme in a way. If you're completely, like, if you don't know how to approach a question, try to predict why they're asking it, which is like predicting the marking scheme of the question. And I don't know if this was too vague. Like, it makes sense in my head, but I'm not sure if...
I think it makes sense in my head as well, but I think like sometimes you got to really like be there, be through that process to understand. But we'll try our best to break it down. So number one, you said... looking at the marking scheme, right? So the marks is an indication of depth you need to go to, and that comes from experience a lot of the times, seeing how far that goes. And secondly, you said looking at the keywords and looking at the information from the question, which made me think back to in those multi-step questions, a lot of the times, because this is maybe it's just me, but in my experience, what really helped was that when I'm on part D, and I know in VCA exams, every part usually relates, or at least the previous parts give you some hint to the next part. So then what would really help me was to, okay, if I'm stuck, if I don't know what I'm doing, look at the previous steps, look at what the theme is, because a lot of the times, especially in methods, they will actually guide you through what they want you to do first, but then they throw you in the deep end independently. So they teach you how to swim first, they give you that method, and then they're like, okay, here it is. You've seen this before, now go do it. But then a lot of times I didn't make that connection. I'm like, okay, I've never seen this before. Like, but all you had to do was go back and read, okay, what the question, why am I doing what I'm doing in the previous parts? Because it's not just random, as you said, like there's a reason why they put it there. So yeah, I think that level of awareness at least helped me. And I think, will definitely help with the problem solving process. It's just one more tool in your box. Yeah.
Yeah, no, 100%. Like looking at previous parts, because there's always going to be progression. If you're at part D, there's a reason there was ABC, like as you said.
Right. Yeah. They're not just like, okay, we got 120 marks, we don't know where to put it. Like, no, exactly. That's usually not what happens. Yeah.
And another thing I would probably say for another kind of tool, I guess, is pattern recognition with questions. So things like, as you said, like I got reminded of this when you said last question on methods exam. A lot of the times that question ends up being something about symmetry. So like lots of the past exam questions have been about exploiting symmetry in a way which gets you to the answer, so you couldn't like evaluate the answer without using that, something like that. And so that's like, that only comes with exposure to exams. And if you've like that, because then you can recognize the pattern of just like, if there's a question that looks hard at first glance, like during reading time, for example, you can then, like, for example, during reading time, if you've seen that question, you have then like 1.5 hours while you're doing the rest of the exam to have that in the back of your mind, processing through those patterns, and maybe something clicks there and you're like, oh, I've seen symmetry before, or I've seen integration before, whatever, like some concept, some like the key to the question, basically the key to like getting past the hard bit is like that often comes from, I think, pattern recognition, which then leads to, you've got to do exams. Like you shouldn't be turning up to an exam having done like one practice exam. Right. You should have been exposed enough to have seen what are the kinds of things examiners look for. Because I think the big difference, then this is like properly getting into it, I guess, is they don't teach you at school how to take an exam. They'll teach you the content, as you said, like they'll guide you through it, but then you get pushed into the deep end. They don't teach you how to then use that guided process for a deep end question. And I think that's a link that's missing, especially in methods. Like that's why methods is such a hard subject, is because it's so convoluted and there's never really that you're never told like how to approach a question.
But I think
you
might have, yeah.
Yep.
But I think you might have touched on something really powerful there. It's about, because in essence, like what you talked about with symmetry, that's not explicitly taught. Like there's no chapter explicitly on symmetry, right? It's always just like integration. You get these individual techniques, but it's like another layer to it. It's like a meta technique, if you like. So do you think there's any value? Because this is like, I think as tutors, this might be a direction that could potentially be worked on, is giving these meta techniques to students, because I don't know if you had any experience with UCAT, but in doing UCAT preparation, we had these abstract questions where you had to compare the two different sets, and they pretty much give you a checklist to go through. Okay, these are the differences that there will be, whether it's like shape, whether it's number, whether it's whatever, right? So I think would it be possible to develop a checklist, something similar to that in methods? So for example, okay, if you see a hard question, this is just coming off I haven't given too much thought into this, so this might be dumb. But anyway, so maybe you can have the checklist of like, okay, have you checked trying the symmetry method? Have you tried graphing? Have you tried like inverse function, whatever? So do you think it's possible to come up with a finite list of these techniques that goes beyond using the individual skills being taught and building that checklist, which is the problem solving kit to give to students, which will allow them to really excel in dealing with all sorts of questions?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's viable, but what
I
are
think
your
that
thoughts?
Probably something like a 80-20 like rule, something like that would apply, in the sense that like you could come up with 80% of the list and it would have worked like 80% of the time or whatever, but that other 20%, that's where if you've extended yourself, then you're able to see those, which is hard because the list wouldn't be a finite list of like 10 things. It might be a finite list of like 150 things, but then at that point it's not a viable list to use in an exam. When you're sitting in an exam, you can't be going through a checklist of like 150 things. So I think at some level it's about either you've practiced enough exams that you know like 140 out of those 150 things, or you've got that exposure from somewhere else, which also works out, I guess.
Which do you think was the case for you? So I guess there's an intrinsic ability in building that skill on the spot. And there's also just if I did 1,000 practice exams, like I'm pretty sure you would have like, like normal distribution, you have like 4 standard deviations. It covers like pretty much like 99 point whatever % of all hard questions they're ever going to throw at you. So which path do you think was more viable to you? And like, was your experience, was it purely just numbers and experience, or rather honing that ability? Because I'm not sure how one actually hones that ability, like explicitly. So yeah, do you want to talk about that?
I think for me, it came more from exposing myself outside than doing practice exams and like doing direct analysis of practice exams and doing that. But I see the value in that 100% if you haven't already, if you don't have that exposure, I guess. Like if you haven't built the skill yet of being able to understand what an exam's asking and why it's asking for it, like that level of like knowing how to work yourself through a question when you're not sure. I think that is worth building in the context of exams just as much as it's worth building. Just the problem solving itself is worth building outside. Because I mean, yeah, if your aim, again, it's like if your aim is to maximize your VCE performance, then I think doing it in the context of an exam is more useful than doing it outside. Doing that problem solving. So like exposing yourself to questions are hard. So find like the hardest company, for example, and just make yourself sit there for 30 minutes and like somehow figure out how to get at least 3 out of the 4 marks in this question. How do I get something that I can then work through and come at an answer? Just like figuring out how can I then just spotting the patterns and like being able to figure out what it's asking. I think doing it in the context of exams is useful for sure.